Best conference I've ever attended, a day and a half, that's it.
It's the last session, and everyone, people read their paper.
Well, why not informally, why don't we just talk about what you and Adam might like to.
Yeah, why don't you get started? I mean, you can read or we can talk. You were scheduled to go first, I think. You know, I won't. I mean, I think I'll mostly read, but I'll kind of break and talk a little bit as well. And we can, we can talk in the middle of the paper. So, but it's up to you how you want to approach it, whatever you're comfortable with.
Because I think our interests are very different.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
So, yeah.
You are talking more about.
You know, there might be more convergences between us than we think. So maybe we'll kind of read our paper and find out.
I have approach is more from the phenomenological and something I'm going to do.
Come and join us. We have a small informal.
Well, we'll see what we have to say afterwards. I mean, so, read yours, I'll read mine, and whatever we want to talk about afterwards. You know? Yeah.
Hi.
Okay.
Do you think we
Well, Adam,
do it all?
yeah, Adam, why don't you kick it off, and then she'll pick up the same sort of pattern.
Yeah.
I don't know because it's.
They're dissimilar topics.
I
Well,
don't think that we is.
One thing that's similar, I think, is that I think we're both talking about anti-Semitism in ways that are different from the way most other people at the conference have been talking about it, which is maybe why they put us here. These are we were the uncategorizable.
Right.
So they invented this category for us. So
Maybe.
you know, so maybe that'll be a way that we'll end up talking about it.
Yeah, maybe.
If you like, I'll go first. I don't mind.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Right. Well, what I'm planning to do with the paper, what I did with the paper is developing a theory of anti-Semitism that's based on another theory. So I'll take a little time talking about that. It's not a very well-known theory, and so I'll kind of, but it's not an extremely complicated theory either. It's a theory of the origin of language, and as such, as a theory of the origin of language, it's also a theory of the origin of culture and religion and pretty much everything human.
Excuse me, you know, in biology we have Darwin's Origin of the Species.
Yes, I know that.
Any connection?
There are connections. I mean, in a certain sense, it's an evolutionary theory.
Okay.
But it's a theory that assumes that humanity comes into being through a kind of break from nature. So that's actually a good place to start. I mean, the best way that I found to explain this is what's called the originary hypothesis, and it's invented by a man named Eric Gans, who's actually a professor of French in UCLA, and he's written quite a few books, sort of elaborated on this. He first presented in 1980, so it's 30 years that he's been sort of developing it and developing theory of history out of it and a whole range of other things. The best starting point is with a theory that's a bit better known. You might still not know, but it's René Girard's mimetic theory. Okay.
What?
You might know about René Girard.
What?
René Girard. He was a French. He's a French literary theorist. Mimetic theory. René Girard. René Girard. Yeah.
Sure.
Ah, yes.
Okay, oh, you know.
Girard.
Oh, Girard, okay, Girard, okay, that's my bad American
yes, because
accent.
French name in English for me
Yeah,
is
yeah,
very difficult to understand.
Right, okay, all right, so I mean.
She speaks Portuguese.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so we're going through three languages
so
here. Yeah.
sometimes it's difficult to understand the names in English. Sorry.
It's okay, so Girard, in any case, argues that human beings are fundamentally mimetic, which is to say they imitate each other. Right, and there's a kind of evolutionary component in this to the extent that obviously the higher animals are, the more mimetic they are, the more they learn from each other, the more they imitate each other, and so on. So what Girard sort of discovered, argued, is that mimesis leads to conflict. right? It leads to conflict because if we're imitating each other, then we end up wanting the same thing. Desire is mimetic as well. Right? Now, he developed this through a theory of the novel, first of all, showing how the novels are constructed through this triangular structure of desire, where there's always two protagonists who end up sort of converging on the same object of desire. And his idea is that the reason they converge, each one wants it because the other one wants it. Right? So desire leads to violence in this case. So then the fundamental problem for human beings is how to control this violence, to prevent it from undermining any possibility of community. Now, Girard's theory was that the way this is done is through the scapegoat mechanism, or what he sometimes calls the victimary mechanism, which is to say one member of the community is selected out and essentially killed.
Oh, so victimary means scapegoat.
Right, well that's kind of the starting point. Then for Gans it kind of takes on these other meanings as well. But that, yeah, it starts with Girard. In other words, some victimization is at the foundation of any human community. So for Girard, this is the origin of the human. Right, the human begins with the establishment of a scapegoat, and for him this is also the origin of religion, because the scapegoat essentially is transformed into God. Right, because after the killing is done, the one killed, the victim, is then commemorated as the one who founded the community. Right, so there's this kind of duality, this kind of ambivalence towards the victim. And Girard kind of traces this not only through the novel, but through mythology. There's all these mythological figures. If you kind of look closely at these myths, then there's always kind of this story of a murder kind of at the bottom of it. Okay, now, I mean, Gans questions some of that, but Gans starts with the same assumption that desire is mimetic and that we converge on the same object, and that therefore preventing violence, controlling violence, regulating violence is sort of the central problem for the human community, violence against each other. Right? So he defines humanity as that species which poses a greater threat to itself than is posed to it by any external force. There is one more of a danger to each other than anything out there in the natural world is a danger to us. For Gans, the way in which the problem is solved is not through the scapegoat. He kind of talks about the scapegoat, but he places that much later in history. For Gans argues that all you really need is a sign. In other words, if you imagine what he calls an originary event or originary scene, where everybody is reaching for some central object. And they're all reaching for it, and at a certain point they can see that they're heading for this violent confrontation. One of them puts forward, or in some combination, it's you don't have to picture it too precisely. Someone puts forward what he calls the aborted gesture of appropriation. In other words, essentially there's a hesitation. And this hesitation is the first sign. This is the beginning of language. That's sort of the first meaningful sign put forward by human beings, right? So pointing towards the object, it's got a referent, it's got a sort of meaning to it. The meaning to it is that we all kind of stop right now and we kind of allow, in a sense, the object to be. Okay, so so for Gans, this is the origin of language, and what it means is that representation is the deferral of violence. So that's essentially what language does, and what all the institutions that follow, rituals and religion and culture and so on. And so human history essentially can be seen as the development of increasingly sort of effective and generalizable, but always fragile mechanisms of deferral, right? Ways of preventing, outbreaks of mimetic desire and the violence that follows from it. Okay, so the way in which I'm going to kind of cut over lines. He talks about sort of primitive community, and he talks about what he calls, he's borrowing from what's his name, not Salins, but another anthropologist, what he calls the big man form of culture, where it's kind of organized around one sort of central sort of God king figure. And he traces through Judaism and Christianity. He's kind of got a way of accounting for all of this. But ultimately, to get us to talk about anti-Semitism, he sees the most sophisticated means of deferral that human beings have invented so far as being the modern market system, essentially, right? And you can think about why that would be if you think about dividing sort of an economic product. The most primitive way of doing it would be, to have one sort of object and everybody sort of, grabs a piece out of it. then a somewhat more sophisticated way of doing it would be each member of the community, again, whether they're families or individuals, doesn't really matter, has a certain amount of property for themselves, and they exchange through barter. And this is what Marcel Mauss calls a gift community, a gift economy, right, which is based on, again, the simplest way of thinking about it is if I invite you to dinner for this Friday, you sort of invite me, a couple of Fridays down the road, right? You don't invite me Saturday, right? There's kind of a logic to it, right? You don't repay the gift right away. There's a sort of decorum and this sort of, there's kind of rules about it, informal rules about it. You'll invite me maybe next Friday or a couple of Fridays down the road. So there's a gift economy, which is more efficient than everybody just kind of grabbing the same object and kind of tearing a piece out of it. But at the same time, it's still, it requires you to kind of bring an object to somebody else and they bring an object to you and so on. And so the next step is essentially the introduction of money, which allows me to trade, with you without having any contact with you at all, right? You sell something to him and I buy it from him, right, using money. So this is a more sophisticated means of deferral, because then there's more objects out there in the world, and each person kind of, gets an object that's more impersonal, so we're not always struggling over the same objects and so on. And so he kind of sees, the development of the market through history, and of course ultimately in modernity, where you have a sort of full-blown market system, as a gradual movement away from, sort of more primitive and in a sense less effective, more fragile means of deferral, which are focused on a very kind of strictly organized ritual system and so on. Okay, so now we can start talking about anti-Semitism. Anyone has questions along the way, you can ask. But it's in the context of the modern market system that Gans first situates anti-Semitism. And I'm going to read a quote from Gans when he's talking about anti-Semitism. The Jew is not, in some undefined sense, a scapegoat for the larger society's frustrations. He serves as a model of the inexistent and unfigurable center of the market system. The Jew, having rejected the incarnation, incarnates the truly unincarnable, mediation. In the post-ritual world of market exchange, the Jew is a paradoxical construction who regulates the self-regulating market, who fixes the prices determined by the interaction of supply and demand. We must eliminate him to gain control over this inhuman mechanism. Okay? In a certain sense, this kind of overlaps with, it overlaps, but it's almost a kind of diametrically opposed image of the way in which Marxists talk about anti-Semitism. Actually, I went to a conference earlier today which was talking about it still in exactly these terms, quoting Adorno and Horkheimer and so on, that the Jew is essentially associated with the center of the market system, right? The market system has no center, right? Everything is kind of in flux, it's dynamic, there's no one controlling, prices and supply and demand kind of continually interact, no one determines what the prices are, no one could determine what the prices are, and so on. This generates all kinds of, again, anxieties, resentments, and dissatisfactions, and so the Jew is essentially placed at the center of this. Okay, so in that sense, in a sense, we can agree with the Marxists on this, except, for the Marxists, this is, a critique of the market system, whereas for Gans, it's more of an inadequate understanding of, or an inadequate engagement with the market system. But at any rate, he's saying something more here, which is the reason why Jews are put in this position. It's not just random. It's not like the Nazis or those who came before the Nazis just kind of said Jews and put them at the center. But he sees this as connected with the discovery of monotheism by the Jews. In other words, the notion of a God who kind of who can't be controlled through rituals. In other words, you can't make a demand upon God who's invisible, who's not accessible in any way, right? God gives you the law, and you sort of follow the law and so on, but you can't. There's no sort of cause and effect with God in the Jewish understanding of monotheism. And then of course the Jews reject, which he alludes to in the passage I just read, rejecting incarnation, right? So the Christians, Christianity in a certain sense found this inaccessible, invisible God sort of intolerable, right? So they incarnated in Jesus, and the Jews kind of resisted that. So the Jews are kind of the inventors of monotheism, and here I'll just read what I wrote. It'll be better than winging it. Antisemitism for Gans is ultimately predicated upon the paradox of the Jewish discovery of monotheism. The Judaic revelation presented knowledge of a single God beyond the means of control of totemic religions, and presented a single humanity whose knowledge of God is most profoundly revealed in the reciprocal relations between humans. At the same time, so there's a God as universal, it's everybody's God, no one kind of has control of it, and so on. At the same time, this very revelation is granted to a single people, chosen to work out before the world the implications of this understanding of the divine. The spread of monotheism, already inscribed in its universalistic origin, could hardly take place other than through resentment towards those who both gave this God to humanity and selfishly claimed an exclusive relation to him. I mean, of course, we can see this, very directly with the Christians, right, who sort of blame, who kind of take the Jewish God and sort of universalize it and say this is what it really meant all along, but at the same time develop this antagonism towards the Jews who don't go along with this, who still kind of hold on to their own sort of archaic and exclusive and sort of selfish relationship to God. And I mean, the same thing more or less takes place with Islam, in a different way. Okay. What Gans calls Jewish narrative monotheism helps lay the groundwork for the eventual emergence of the modern market, not only by defetishizing local totems, but by separating faith in God and the obligation to follow the law from the national power and success of the Jewish people. If defeats and even destruction of the nation are given meaning by demands and promises that transcend those temporal events, then moral meaning can be found in the contingencies of history rather than the maintenance of a closed ritual system. I look at that a little bit differently. The idea here is that, this is kind of a reading of the Bible, essentially, which suggests that, something very unique happens with the Jewish people in the Bible, which is they lose their homeland, their state is destroyed, but rather than just sort of abandoning God and then taking the God of whatever, new social system they get incorporated into, as I'm pretty sure has been the case through most of history, right? God protects you. If he doesn't protect you, if your community gets destroyed, well, then you go find protection from some other God. That doesn't happen with the Jews, right? They read, and the Bible is kind of a record of this, right? Reading all of these defeats and destruction and exile and so on as essentially messages from God, right? So history becomes meaningful, right? And again, this is something that Gans is suggesting that the Jews invented, making that history can become meaningful because you're playing out the relationship between the nation and God's will through history. And again, I'm suggesting here that this is kind of a Jewish contribution to the modern market, ultimately, because the sorts of dispositions and attitudes and habits that you need to act on the modern market are, let's say, a kind of patience, right? There are ups and downs, right? And things get better and things get worse, and you sort of, you have patience to follow through a longer historical process, and you don't assume that there's some kind of direct cause and effect between what you do today and what you get tomorrow, right? So this kind of, longer historical view that is needed for, that you see even in kind of modern Republican theories, small R Republican theories of government have this component to it, right? That sort of the history of the nation is sort of the history of its, Spinoza is probably the best example of this sort of history of your following, making good laws and following those laws and so on. But this contribution of Judaism to modernity collides with the more specifically Christian contribution, or rather the revision of Christianity constitutive of modernity. All right, what I'm starting to do here is kind of trace these two paths to modernity. Kind of convergent paths, one that comes from a sort of revision of Judaism, and one that comes from a sort of revision of Christianity. And there's other stuff in modernity as well, but that's what I'm focusing on here. All right, according to Gans, and here I'm quoting again, where Jews had understood that the real center was inhabited by the being of the sign, the Christians realized that this being was generated and could be generated anew by an act interpretable as victimization. In other words, while Jewish victimization was already a sign of Jewish chosenness, right, obviously already for Judaism, the fact that, that the Jews, that there's antagonism towards the Jews is in a sense kind of proof of their election, this was a burden borne by Jews alone, right? There's nothing in Judaism that kind of suggests that anybody else has to do this, right? That anybody else has to kind of form this unique relationship to God, and so on. For Christianity, the persecution of Jesus is imitable, and identification with it the source of salvation. Okay, so this is kind of where Christianity, in a sense, breaks with Judaism. But this also meant that Christianity provides the model for anti-Semitism. And here I'm quoting Gans again. The anti-Semite compels the Jew to enter the infernal circle of rivalry and persecution in order to reenact his own Christian conversion. He is the new Paul, and the Jew is the Saul he used to be. Okay, so again, here he's talking, there was a talk yesterday that kind of set up something similar, that Christianity sort of needs this sort of persecutory relationship with Judaism, this figure of the Jew to constitute itself. Okay, now...
That it has to persecute the Jews, or that it has to be persecuted like the Jews?
No, that has to persecute the Jews, right? But in a sense, you're picking up on something that I said, which I'll follow up on now, which is victimization and a persecutory sort of attitude is central to Christianity, and it plays into modernity through Romanticism, right? This kind of, Gans sort of works through what he calls the constitutive hypocrisy of Romanticism, which is the romantic individual performs his rejection of the market system, right, and proclaims a sort of, this goes back to Rousseau, who was sort of the first example of this, proclaims this kind of unanimous rejection by all of, bourgeois society, but does that ultimately in order to construct a compelling persona, to operate within bourgeois society. I mean, there are so many examples of this. It's so much a part of capitalist or bourgeois society, whatever you want to call it, we just take it for granted. There's just these obvious examples like James Dean, right, whose figure was exactly that. Right?
So épaté bourgeois.
What?
Épaté bourgeois.
Yeah, well, that's a big part, right? Yeah, you arouse all of this antagonism towards you, but again, that just makes you the center of attention, right, and increases your value within bourgeois. And every movie star in some way kind of situates themselves. Rock stars in the whole history of American popular culture, you could talk about in this way. You shock people, and then 20 years later you get knighted, right? So he's kind of tracing this, and again, you can sort of trace this back to Christianity. This is sort of you could say secularization of Christian understandings of victimization and persecution and so on, but in a safer way now. You don't actually have to die at this point. It's kind of an act by now. Okay. In abiding tension with this individualistic gesture, so that's part of it. This is how the market develops. This is how we kind of enter the market, right? This is why every teenager has to have their own distinctive look, right? Every teenager has to be everyone's against me. I'm going to show who I really am, and so on. And that's how in our culture, that's how you develop your individuality, right? By being persecuted and hated and kind of sacrificed, and then you sort of emerge with your own with your own distinctive style out of that. It's funny, it's kind of hypocrisy, but at the same time it's productive, right? It sort of works, and I'm not sure there's something else, right, to replace it with. Something very similar happens with nationalism, which is, the development of nationalism takes place in the same way. Each nation has to sort of liberate itself from some oppressor, whether it's internal or external, whether it's a feudal regime or it's some kind of, colonialist oppressor, which at the same time is a kind of mimetic model, right? We want to be like the ones who are oppressing us, but we have to, antagonize them. We have to struggle against them at the same time. And again, the national liberation takes place in the same way through martyrs, right? Who become the founders of the nation and so on. Okay, and then Gans argues anti-Semitism intensifies in the bourgeois era because it is at this point in history that persecution, which grants significance, comes to be preferable to indifference. At this point, the Jew's indifference to Jesus is no longer a veil covering his guilt for the crucifixion. It is itself the ultimate persecution. To opt out of the theater of national life is ipso facto to operate in the hidden realm of conspiracy. The Jew is the ultimate dandy, whose detachment from society, in principle, regardless of fact, is a sign of his omnipotence. The anthropological meaning of anti-Semitism may be expressed in terms of the market. but only insofar as the lesson of the modern market is itself understood as a transhistorical revelation concerning human exchange. The Jew is designated the subject of the market because, faithful to the empty center revealed by the burning bush, he remains in principle indifferent to the object, whether of persecution or adoration that he finds there. In other words, again, this goes back to the same, the Christians put a person at the center of their sacred scene, and the Jews don't, right? And so, as modernity develops through nations that also put the kind of figure at the center of the scene, and the Jews, again, it doesn't really matter what the Jews are actually doing at this point. The configuration, the Jew-Christian relationship is configured in such a way that the Jews are seen as those who are indifferent to what's at the center of the scene. So that by itself abstracts them from, again, what he calls the theater of national life. And which again, goes back to the situation of Jews at the center. They must be hiding something, they must be controlling things behind the scene, and so on. Okay, the fury of the here this is me, but I'm kind of going back into quoting in a second here. The fury of the Nazis' assault against the Jews gathered together all these threads of the anti-market revolt within a desperate attempt to displace the primacy of the Jews and falsify their narrative. Again, this is a quote from Gans. Enraged at the Jews' monotheistic equanimity in defeat and disaster, the Nazis hoped to inflict on them a catastrophe so great that it could not be understood as a message of God to his people. Okay, which I think is actually a pretty original way of understanding what the Nazis were trying to do, right? To inflict a catastrophe so great that it wouldn't fit the narrative anymore, right? All the other narratives.
Extermination.
Right, in other words, all the other narratives, right, getting driven out of your homeland and so on, we can fit that in, God is punishing us and so on, but this is too big, this kind of breaks the whole thing, which in a certain sense it did, right? That narrative sort of really hasn't worked for Jews
For many people.
Well, we don't have to quantify it. I think probably for most Jews afterwards, but either way, it certainly damaged them significantly. Okay, so this is anti-Semitism up through into the capitalist period, up through the Holocaust. Okay, now something new happened, so I'll start reading a bit and see if I need to stop. The ultimately omnicidal potential for human violence revealed by the Holocaust introduces something new into this equation. The Holocaust marks the beginning of the Victimary Era. So now this word victimary is going to start to take on a slightly different meaning, in which we are now living. The virulent hatred of the Nazis towards the Jews drew the world into a cataclysmic struggle, the like of which we will not survive again in the nuclear age. And Gans kind of talks about this in various places that I'm sort of cutting out, where you have to think about, the impact of the Holocaust, which Gans says someplace is kind of the closest thing to a divine revelation that we've had in the modern period. The impact of the Holocaust has to be sort of combined with Hiroshima, sort of coming right after. Because, not that there's any equivalence between Hiroshima and the Holocaust, but it's more that if you take the Holocaust and apply to it the means that we now have, as revealed through Hiroshima, then...
You get around.
Then what?
You get around.
Well, maybe, but we get something we can't tolerate. Right. In other words, the Nazis with the atomic bomb would kind of reach the levels of violence that, we're at this point where it's not even clear humans could survive such a violent, cataclysm at this point. Okay, so the eschewing of such hatred must be at the center of a new system of deferral constructed after the war. So whatever looks like, and of course, what looks like is can be very variable. Whatever looks like the Nazi-Jew relation must be uncompromisingly prescribed. Okay, so in other words, what Gans calls the Victimary Era now is where this Nazi-Jew asymmetry becomes sort of the model for all social relations, right? So any asymmetry, however minor, you can talk about it now in terms of at least its potential to move towards this kind of extreme Nazi-Jew relationship. And again, if you really look at, anything, anti-racist discussions, anti-colonialist, feminist, even environmentalists.
Anti-Islamophobic.
Just about anything that's come out, really since World War II, it really takes this shape more and more kind of mechanically and automatically as time goes on. Even now we have global warming deniers, right? So even that's the notion of denying it comes from Holocaust denial. So it's like this becomes this vocabulary that's used to describe everything, right? Which of course creates an incentive to make one's own grievance fit that model, right? So in other words, your grievance will get the more attention, the more you can frame it as analogous to the Nazi Jew model. And you can find it, I mean, really, you can find this all the way through. You can easily write a whole paper. I mean, you can write a whole book showing, you know, the anti-colonial, anti-racist, how, you know, the Nazi Jew image or you know, structure just became this all-encompassing vocabulary that just was used to describe everything. And still today, I don't think it's any less so today. If anything, it's even more intense today. Which is, in a sense, we're kind of stuck in something, right? Is sort of the idea here. Because obviously this place limits on other ways of thinking about what might be less extreme antagonisms and makes problems that might be fairly easily solvable or at least sufferable seem intolerable and to require some kind of extreme solution. The Jews are once again placed in a paradoxical position. First of all, the response on the part of the Jews to the consequences of their utter defenselessness in the Holocaust is to create and with growing unanimity support a Jewish nation state. But the nation state, with its ethnic exclusivity, preparedness for belligerency, and narrow self-interest, is one of those things that looks very much like Nazism. Second, the victimary principle can only be universalized if the Jewish monopoly on Holocaust guilt is broken. The best way to do so is to present the Jews as oppressors, at least just like the rest of us, at worst uniquely so, insofar as they've exploited the world's guilt so as to perpetuate the very conditions that enable their own victimization, only this time at the expense of others. Finally, so again, this kind of converges with a lot of what we've been hearing the last couple of days. This very sort of unique, really hatred towards Israel comes from this, that the Jews were the victims and they use that victimization to kind of play this trick on everyone else and become victimizers in turn and so on.
So the scapegoat reverses the role.
Yeah, right. So, you know, Israel, the Jews have to kind of be flipped.
Israeli Goliath, Palestinian David.
Yeah, right. Which of course has been framed exactly in terms of Nazi Jew, right? And here with this kind of
that's the sadistic version.
Right, and you know, which kind of has this added, it has this added sadism to it that you're calling, you know, Jews Nazis now, and so on. It's got this kind of, which increases the, you know, what's the word, frisson for, you know, for a lot of, you know, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist people. Wow, we're calling Jews Nazis. Right? Doesn't get more exciting than that, right? Right, yeah, exactly. Finally, then, the emergence of a new victim, the Palestinians, the victim of the Jews, completes the victimary metaphysics first set in motion by the essentially theological response to the Holocaust. The victimary system, then, depends upon this new expanded anti-Semitism in which the Jews are scapegoated for the crimes of the West, as well as for the intensifying resentments toward the West. So the Jews are guilty of the crimes of the West, but they're also guilty for the fact that you know, that Islam is right. Coming now in particular from the most bitter, if not the oldest of those resentments, that of Islam. It was the Israeli victory in the '67 war that made it possible to maneuver the Jews ideologically out of the victimized and into the victimizing position. But this maneuvering might have gone no further than the kind of standard anti-colonial critique applied to the US and Vietnam or the European powers, without the increasing abandonment of nationality on the part of the Western Europeans and the rise of radical Islam. In this context, as Gans says, we are first of all, and I'll quote a little from Gans again, struck by the similarity between medieval and modern Christian anti-Semitism. In both cases, the Jew is accused of remaining behind in the old Israel, rather than entering the new Israel of Christianity. It is by this suspicious archaism that he betrays his immoral preference for honoring the historical memory of his monotheistic discovery over its inherent promise of universality. So the Jew preserves his own privileged relation to God over, you know, the benefits of God for everybody, right? The dissemination of this message to everybody. Whether well-poisoned or a protocol worshiper, the Jew is accused of refusing to love his non-Jewish neighbor as himself. Okay.
It's really not his non-Jewish neighbor as himself, it's his non-Jewish neighbor as his fellow Jew.
Yes.
He's being accused of not allowing the Gentile into the circle
Right.
of us, even if he treats him well.
Yeah, that's right, because there's always some, added value
Right.
to the, to the intra-Jewish relationship. I'll skip a little bit here, and get to his discussion about Islam, and how that plays into it, and then kind of finish up. With the most politically influential currents of contemporary Islam, meanwhile, we do most emphatically see a rejection of the market. In other words, Europe is maybe rejecting nationality, but they're not really quite rejecting the economic market, right? They're rejecting, what I would suggest, and I think Gans is suggesting is a component of the market. You can't have, ultimately, I don't think you can have an economic market without nation states, because without nation states, you can't really have a rule of law where those applying the law, implementing the law, making the law are in some way accountable to those who the law is applied to. I mean, it doesn't really work on a global scale, right? You need sort of more local national units to do that. But at any rate, the European antagonism towards Israel comes from, again, for the Europeans, we're moving past all of that. Nationality, nationalism, that's what led us to, to the Holocaust and all that other stuff. We're moving past that, but Israel just keeps dragging us back, right, into this muck and mire of nationality and all the wars and antagonism that comes with it.
When you refer to the economic market, I've in the past been a consultant for the World Health Organization, and Israel is in with the European countries because of their association, obviously, their lack of solidarity with the Middle East. And it's strange because when you take a look at the economy of Israel and the economy of Europe, you're probably much closer than the economy of Israel and their neighbors. But they've been banned from being in the Eastern Mediterranean region of the World Health Organization,
Right.
and assigned a role in with the European group. Yeah. They don't fit.
Right, yeah, I mean, first of all, they have to be recognized by all those countries, right? I guess that you have to participate in an organization with them. Maybe, let's see, the way in which he talks about Islamic anti-Semitism in particular is...
What's his first name?
Eric.
Okay.
E-R-I-C. And, if you want to learn more about Gans and all of this, he's got a website called Anthropoetics.
Generative anthropology,
Yeah, that's it.
in a way of thinking.
That's it.
Good for poetic.
What's your name?
Anthropoetics. I'm going to write it up on the board there.
Anthropoetics, the Journal of Generative Anthropology.
Yeah, and he's got it, there's nothing to write here with, but A-N-T-H.
I do want to for me, please.
Yes. It's a journal, and he's got there, and most of what I'm actually quoting from is if you see on that,
His full name is?
Eric Gans.
G-A-N-S.
Anthro. T-H-R-O, sorry.
And this?
P-O-E, sorry.
G-A-N-S.
P-O-E.
Anthropoetics.
Yeah.
And this is the journal.
Yeah, it's a website, it's got the journal, and it's got what he calls the Chronicles of Love and Resentment, and most of what I'm quoting is actually from that.
He likes your stuff too.
Yeah, we've been working together. I kind of found out about this now, it's only about 10 years since, and so, we become friends, and
It's a big Gans family in New Haven.
oh yeah, it's a pretty common name also.
Right.
I've seen a lot of places
Right.
lately. He talks about Islamic anti-Semitism mostly in terms of Muslims, at least radical Muslims, kind of see themselves as outside of the market, as opposed to with the European countries, it was the Jews kind of usurping within a country. But with the Islamists, it's more of a sort of global antagonism from outside the market to inside the market. I'll just read a conclusion, then we'll come back and talk about anything that I want to. What's your name?
Ilana.
Give Ilana a chance to talk
Yes,
as
I
well.
think we have to finish it.
No,
Yeah.
3:45.
3:45. Okay.
3:45, it's 3:07-ish.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just read. Just take me about 5 minutes, and then on yours. Okay. I guess I'll just say, the conclusion, I think, is we cannot effectively address this emergent anti-Semitism without addressing the pathology surrounding the global market. On the one hand, the form taken on the marketplace by what Gans calls Jewish firstness, which is kind of, again, the discovery of anti-Semitism, the discovery of monotheism and so on, is that of the centrality of the entrepreneur, who organizes capital and introduces a new division of labor and creates new desires. Despite claims of consumer supremacy, which is kind of one of the ways we talk about, market society, where the consumer is sovereign and so on, one source of the mysteriousness of the market's workings is precisely that new products enter the market before anyone has been asking for them or has even thought of them. Tales of consumer manipulation take on their plausibility from this fact. In other words, things really do come out into the market, right, that nobody's been looking for, that seems to be coming from nowhere. Similarly, the solicitation of investment capital from the outside inevitably looks conspiratorial, especially when heavily regulated markets require political maneuvering before new projects can get off the ground. We can see exploitative and deceptive entrepreneurial practices as exceptions to the rule in a fundamentally beneficial market process. Or we can see the honest worker and consumer as the victim of malevolent and unaccountable market players. Which perspective we adopt, doesn't depend upon the facts, right? It's kind of a fundamental starting point. It's not like you can add up the bad things businessmen do versus the good things they do, and kind of arrive at a conclusion based on that. So it's kind of a more fundamental attitude towards what you think the market is. Which perspective we adopt will determine the way we think about regulating economic institutions, and only a fundamentally benevolent view of the market will make it possible to accept the basic asymmetry between producers and consumers, capital and labor, and resist the search for scapegoats for our disappointments on the market. So I'll just leave it there and just say that, the only way to get over anti-Semitism ultimately, if the Jew is kind of placed at the center of the market, is to, in a sense, grow up and have a mature view of the market. It's not getting transcended, and we're not going to overcome it. We're not going to come up with some more authentic way of distributing economic products. We're always going to have this market, which is indirect, which is complicated, which disappoints, which leads to corruption and all kinds of other things. And we have to kind of, if that's our horizon, then you can have a totally different attitude towards it. And then anti-Semitism kind of gets marginalized. Yeah.
Did you go to the session, the last set of breakout sessions, there was a talk by Bjorn Milbrandt, University of Marburg, Conceptualizing Contemporary Anti-Semitism in Germany, theoretical, whatever. One of the things that he pointed out was that without it being anti-Semitic at all, German media is pervaded by images of market forces that really are just drawing Nazi imagery but removing the direct connection to Jews, but sort of cockroaches and locusts that devour and so on, using all these metaphors to describe the bosses. So in that sense, a profoundly immature understanding. Yeah.
And I would say sooner or later the Jew will get
and that's what he said. He said, look, it's only, all you have to do is put a little Jewish star in the eye of the cockroach, and you're there.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. All right, well, thank you.
So I'll be reading because my English is not so good. So but reading. My paper, I will try to bring something very different from everything that I have been listening these days here. I'm a psychoanalyst and an anthropologist, a socioanthropologist, and have been working the last few years with a philosophy, they call it Einstein. I don't know if somebody has heard about it. She's Einstein.
Oh yeah, sure, of course.
Philosopher. She was a Jewish one that lived in Germany in the first half of the century, and she was a disciple of Edmund Husserl, and she was a very, very brilliant student and his assistant, and she worked a lot of phenomenology and wrote a lot of important books about the human person and about politics, the state, the notion of people, and about human, and about religion, and many important questions in her times. She was very participating, excuse my English, participating a lot in all the movements and the Weimar Republic, and very active and very someone that give a lot of contributions in her living time and leave a lot of important books for us to read and to understand our time. Her books are being translating to many languages nowadays and studying too. She converted to Catholicism. She became a nun, a monk, and was arrested and died in Auschwitz, and was canonized by the Pope, Paul II. And she had all a discussion about her. You know about somebody. Know about her. But that's not my point. My point is her contribution about understanding our world. And like a psychoanalyst, I read her books and I want to give you some of her thoughts about what we can understand about from her point of view. The first thing is her work about empathy. Her doctoral thesis was about empathy. For her, her profound study about empathy was she saw it like not I read now because it's being more beautifully Edith Stein was one of the most talented disciples of Husserl. In her PhD thesis about empathy, she called attention on this human being characteristic, putting it in evidence as part of the human structure, demonstrating that it is a life experience that allows us to recognize human alterity. We have true empathy and experience that inform us about a structural similarity with the other, although we are configured concretely in different manners. The empathy or anthropathy is the recognition of alterity, a cognitive fact. Alterity tells me there is something similar to me in the other human being, although reaction in a psychic level could be different. Our psychic life is very important to us. Through it, we feel sympathy, attraction, and even love as a possibility to be good to another person, allowing him to develop and fulfill himself in a spontaneous choice. We can also feel antipathy that in extreme can make us hate the other, which as a spontaneous attitude from us lead us to try to eliminate the other human being and to deny his humanity. This caused extreme intolerance as occurred with Nazism through Jews, homosexuals, deficients, gypsies, among others. Human beings are plastic, expressing themselves culturally in very different ways, but their physical structures are similar, what make all of us human beings in spite of having different psychic attitudes. Edith Stein made a complete phenomenological analysis in her book, The Structure of Human Person, in the year 1933, where she speaks about of the body, the psyche, and the spirit. Each human being is singular, unique, but shares with the other human beings the same structure. Their perceived grasp is structurally similar. Everything that happens to us is connected to our structure, where attraction and repulsion are always present. In her works, Edstein demonstrated that the refusal of similarity of the structure of the human person can make one hate different. Beyond the psychic and cultural difference exists a common humanity with a common fundamental and basic dimension in the necessities and primary affections. Edstein lived in the center of the crucial historic events that shaped the first half of the last century. As an intellectual deeply involved with the question of her time, she dedicated herself not only on philosophical issues, but also pedagogical, political, and religious matters, and even about the female condition. Edith was part of a little-known group who converted Jews to Catholicism. She born in Breslau, now Poland, in a liberal Jewish family, and I go through this because I already talked about. She was always interested in political events, that's what I said, and she soon understood that the National Socialism was not only a political party, but proposed itself as a myth and as a way of life. The political events of 1933 in Germany compelled Stein, already a Carmelite nun, to begin to write her autobiographic book called About the Life of a Jewish Family, with the intention that she mentioned in the preface to show the life of a Jewish family. She always kept very strong ties with Judaism, mainly with her mother, her family, and the Jewish community, which constituted her human formation, and more widely with the Jewish people, to which she always mentioned to belong.
This is even after she converted?
Even after. Through her family story, she wanted to give a concrete example of a Jewish community, linked not only on blood ties, opposing to those who supported the idea that it is a race that delineate and distinguish human beings. Analyzing the notion of people in one of her works, she said that the blood ties are relative, being predominant the spiritual legacies. For her, people is a spiritual community. At this time, saw the Nazi phenomenon sustained, among other reasons, by the mistake of approaching the human being and the world from the Illuminist and the rationalist point of view. During those turmoil days, Edstein also wrote a letter to Pope Pio XI. This letter has religious, moral, and political values because she asked him to take a spiritual position, to leave his silence and write an encyclical condemning anti-Judaism, alerting him to the dangers of Hitlerism for the Catholic Church itself, of which neither negotiations nor collaborationist politics will save. The symptoms were very deep, in many sensible zones, as education, youth, human rights, race, atheism, totalitarianism. Her diagnosis was very accurate because she takes a stand that placed her among the victims. But she did get no answer to this letter and was very much disappointed. And in her own words, she wrote, "I noticed some Pope received my letter. I'm sure he may remember it many times." Because she was diagnosing very well what was going to happen. Her foresights were born from deep studies clear information, interior liberty, ethical indignation, solidarity feelings, high conceptions of politics and state, of dignity and knowledge of the rights of human persons. Neither the letter nor her written family story gave any immediate fruits, but they are documents of an extraordinary moral strength and immense historic value that make possible comprehend what was life's situation at that moment. Edith Stein's life is undissociable from the story of the Jewish people, and as the Portuguese and Spanish converts of the 16th century, she was persecuted and murdered, not for her ideas or creed, but for her Jewish origin, even though she converted to Catholicism and turned to be a Carmelite nun. Pope John Paul II, when he canonized her in October 1998 with the name of Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, said, Jew, philosopher, Carmelite, martyr. She brings in her intense life a dramatic synthesis of our century. The work of Edith Stein has been translated to many languages, as I said, and studied intensely in these last years. She criticized the modern world that originated National Socialism and Stalinism, questioning the potential disease of the human being resulting from epistemological perspective of the theories used for his studies and treatments. And this is very important because we still today use the same perspectives to study the man, ourselves, and to treat, then I'm thinking about the psychological and the medical treatments we use to take care of ourselves, and many of these methodological and epistemological ways are making us more sick instead of taking care and solve our problems. She stands her view of her situation lived by human beings in our days, worried with the dignity of every human being, and already warning us from the 30s of last century about the enormous dangers of our modern society, such as pragmatism, efficiency, directing our eyes to the essential. To be able to admit the other, the different, the strange, we must enlarge profoundly our dimensions and accept the differences. Welcoming the other is based in acknowledgement of similarities, but also implies in a moral and ethic attitude. Even if the other, the different, the stranger, bother me, and I feel antipathy for him, and want to eliminate him from my path, is a human being like me. This ethic question, suggested and so important at its time, will be touched in the following under the psychoanalytic approach. And now I want to call the attention to the contribution of psychoanalytical experience and how we see nowadays the ethical experience that we are able to have like human beings. How we can have an ethical experience. It's not a simple thing. The recognition of the other in his diversity is expressed in the same etymology of the Greek word ethos, from which derives ethic, that brings us two meanings, home and homeland. The first is a place to live. The second emphasizes social bonds from which we origin. The word ethic refers to the necessary condition for human happening, and allows each subject to live in a world inserted in a community. homeland, a place to live, means a place to be that is direct and profoundly related to the question of the meaning of life. This place, considered a condition to the emergence of the being, is, in reality, the we inside which the subject can build his singularity. It is the founding relation with others, the belonging to a collective group, being part of a community that constitutes the basic condition to become the subject and to develop his singularity. Usually, the ethical experience is seen as fruit of learning, of aggregation to a personality that is being formed, organized, what leads to the importance of a socially given to education, helping children information through which the ethical register as a personal experience. That's what normally we think, that we'll teach a child to be ethical. We teach him. But in the contemporary psychoanalytical clinic, we have the necessity of paying attention to the base of the human condition. And what we have seen is that the ethical question is not only an aggregated register, an acquisition due to learning, but is part of the human condition itself, of what is original. Thus, there is, from the beginning, a foreboding of the ethic. This is a very interesting phenomenon. A child that can experiment being carried in any way receives an offer of an experience that gives her some knowledge about ethics, a founding element upon which countless other psychic elements can happen. Can you follow? Mm-hmm. Prior to be an action, care defines an attitude that expresses the consideration for the other and his necessities. When this ethical care doesn't happen, we have the presence of ruptures,